Now, one thing that can be confusing when you're getting started with Angular and when you're learning Angular is the versioning of Angular. It all started with AngularJS, or Angular 1 as it's also called, which was released a couple of years ago. This was the first version, and it was a totally different version of Angular that worked totally differently. Now, the Angular team found out that AngularJS, Angular 1, basically wasn't future-proof because of some fundamental flaws in the way it was written. And therefore, they completely rewrote it, and the result of that was Angular 2, which was released in 2016. Now, Angular 2 is a totally different framework than Angular 1, and nowadays, unless you have a really good reason, you shouldn't use Angular 1 anymore. But you actually also won't be using Angular 2 because there have been a couple of other versions of Angular as well. Angular version 3 was skipped for some internal reasons, but then we had Angular 4 and a couple of other versions, and then we arrived at Angular 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and so on. So we got a bunch of Angular versions. Now, all these versions, however, are the same frameworks. The only difference is between Angular 1 and 2. We just have that many versions because the Angular team releases a new major version every 6 months. But that does not mean that every 6 months the framework changes entirely. The opposite is the case. Instead, it just means that there is a clear release schedule, but the changes from version to version are pretty minor, and Angular is very backward compatible. Indeed, it hasn't changed that much since Angular 2 was released. It actually has internally, but not regarding the code you write. And therefore it's super stable, and we only have those small incremental backwards compatible changes. Therefore, for that reason, we typically don't refer to Angular by its version number, but instead we just differentiate it from Angular 1, which is just called AngularJS. And all the versions from Angular 2 on and higher are typically referred to as just Angular. So the framework name is just Angular, and we have all these versions, but you can ignore that because Angular 12 is basically the same as Angular 11 and so on. And what you learn in this course applies to the latest version of Angular.